Great. So I think I'm going to start here. We've got all the students here, and people are joining as they come, and I'm letting them in. But I think to be respectful of everybody's time, we're going to get started here. So first, I just want to say that I'm delighted to welcome everyone who's here this evening in person in this classroom, but also online from the wider school that you're able to join us, of course, in addition to Robin. So my name is Evan Shea. I'm an assistant professor at UVA, and we're hosting this kind of mini lecture series as part of a special topic seminar this fall 2021 called Autonomous Vehicles, Imagining Urban Futures, which really examines the kind of latent and transformative impact that AVs and mobility and transportation in general have on the future urban form of our cities. So this seminar is being jointly offered between the Schools of Architecture and Planning. And as you can see here, our seminar class is here in person at Campbell Hall, but we're also joined digitally by many others from the school. So a little bit about the format this evening. We will have a short lecture by Robin, followed by a lengthier question and answer session. So following her lecture, I'm gonna open up the floor first to the students of the seminar, and then open it up to all questions from those attending digitally, including, and so for those of you who are attending digitally, please feel free to raise your hand and I will moderate and call on you. And so without further ado, now I'm really super delighted to introduce Robin Chase and tell you all a little bit about her background. So Robin is a transportation entrepreneur. She is the co-founder and former CEO of Zipcar, which is the largest car sharing company in the world, as well as Buzzcar, which I like to call the Airbnb of cars. She is also the co-founder of Veniam, which is a network company that deals with the software and hardware of data communication between vehicles and between vehicles and the cloud. She published a recent book called Peers Inc., How People and Platforms Are Inventing the Collaborative Economy and Reinventing Capitalism. And her current passion is working with cities to maximize the transformation possible with the introduction of self-driving vehicles. She sits on the board of the World Resource Institute and serves on the Dutch Multinational Sustainability Advisory Board, lecturing widely and being frequently featured in the major media, having received many awards, including Time's 100 Most Influential People, Fast Company's Fast 50 Innovators, and BusinessWeek's Top 10 Designers. She graduated from Wellesley College and MIT's School of Management, and was also a Harvard University Loeb Fellow, and also received an honorary Doctorate of Design from the Illinois Institute of Technology. So we are obviously super lucky to have you, Robin, join us this evening, given this long, lengthy list of credentials and qualifications that I've just abbreviated. I'm sure the list goes on. And we're super excited for you to hear you speak, of course. So please join me in welcoming Robin. And with that, I will pass it on to you, Robin, for your screen share.
Hi, everyone. It's really delightful to be here. Let's see if I can do this with one shot. Hi. So I now see myself, so I'm thinking that you can also see me. It really is, I'm happy that Evan asked me at the beginning of your course, because I want to start with some context setting. And there are so many issues that as I was thinking about this talk, it just felt like it was going on and on and on and on. So I decided to say a lot of things in this context setting and then leave a big space and time to Q&A. And I understand last week you heard some interesting context setting. So if I think about anything about transportation policy, it so, I think of transportation as the center of the universe. It's kind of the glue in our day. And so it is so interdisciplinary and affects everything we do, and across all ages and all economies and globally. And so that's why I am talking about this little context here. So the first part is going to be slightly chart driven. And then I promise that I will be my passionate self. I might even be my passionate self to begin with. So I know you heard about Jeanette Sadik-Khan last week, and she's a friend of mine. When I first started working on autonomous vehicles, she was so angry because she thought people go after the shiny thing, and AVs are the next shiny thing, and they're not addressing anything that was interesting to her. So I want us to just think harder, and that's why I want this context about what is it that autonomous vehicles will solve and what won't they solve, and what does it mean? Where is it going to get us? So we always talk about safety, and I do think about I think it's 1.3 million traffic fatalities annually globally, and maybe 7 million traffic fatalities, 7 million injuries from accidents. But there is this beautiful chart here. I'm just going to close myself out of this. In fact, I'm going to take out my picture of myself so I can see my slides. This was produced by this NGO that I like, and what I want you to look at, and can you see my cursor? We're always focused on this red here, road injuries, and we say, yeah, AVs are going to do away with those 37,000 in the US deaths, and as I say, 1.3 million worldwide. And that's a good number, but here is all the health impacts of automobility. And so if we have electric AVs, which I want to say when I first started thinking about AVs 5 years ago, that was not a given. And so that was one fight that I started having. I emailed the head of Ford's innovation, and I said, are your AVs going to be electric? And he said, oh, we're going to wait and see what the how customers guide us. And I thought, no, they have to be EV. But that would address this through air pollution deaths. But you can still see, and I'm going to talk a bit about this, look at the size of the deaths through inactivity there on the left, or through inactivity, or just these other things down there, tuberculosis, I guess will be okay. But it's not all about traffic safety. So cars just through themselves have this huge other issues associated with them. And so to this piece around health and activity, this is kind of shocking to me whenever I look at this. Let me go back so we can look at this chart. This is, sorry, it's blurry, from 1997 to relatively today. The incidence of obesity among, this is adults, I think. Let me just move this, shoot this kind of in the middle of my screen. I'm not able to see what that says. And you can see that it's gone from 19% to 31%. Like, that is incredible, crazy. And then when I look at it from the standpoint of equity, the incidence of obesity is even higher in Black and Hispanic populations. And there's this great researcher that you should look up if you're interested in this, called Charles T. Brown, and he calls it arrested mobility. And his research shows that Blacks are 54% less likely to be active regardless of where they live. And if we could address the inactivity problem and reduce obesity, and I'd say there's many ways to address that inactivity problem, but cars are certainly one, and AVs will be worse, as we'll be talking to it. I mean, there's just so much money on the table to do other interesting things than our huge bill resulting from obesity. So if I think about AVs, I'm going to say this now, and I'll probably be saying it again later. Wait, I'm just going to keep going because I think I have it in here. And so is it going to address congestion or space efficiency? Maybe yes and maybe no. And so here is how much space we've devoted in our public rights of way relative to, here's passenger capacity of different modes of transport. And so you can see that when we go by car, it's a pitiful number of people, and how many more people we can move per lane by all these other modes. So again, cars are just the worst possible way of moving people. And it's not just cities. When I think about the price of our highway infrastructure across the country, just to build an extra additional lane of traffic when everyone's moving around by cars, it's a crazy amount of money. Moving on. I'm hoping that you guys in your lives have seen this. This is really famous among transportation professionals. This series, this particular one, I think was shot, it looks like it's Dutch. So space required to transport 60 people. And so this was taken, I think, in the 70s. So here's 60 people in their cars, 60 people in the cars by car, 60 people fitting into one bus, how much space we have, and 60 people if they went by bicycle and how much space they take. And on Twitter, I saw this great series here. So here it is by car, here it is by Uber, and here it is by autonomous vehicle. In other words, autonomous vehicles are cars. They're basically cars. If we don't do any other thing, it's just a car. It's just a car that you don't drive. And I will say that it's even worse. But and this, again, I just want to hit this home to you because I love these slides and they're so compelling. This is in Seattle. Here are 200 people and 177 cars. And you would look at this as a transportation planner saying, oh my God, maybe we need to build an elevated highway because they've already taken the parking off of either side. And how are we going to fit more people and address this congestion? And statistically, this is exactly what it looks like. 70% of the people are sitting alone in their cars. And there is an incredible amount of capacity, but we're all sitting alone in our 120 square feet of car, and we're all being moved, our 150-pound bodies are being moved in these 2-ton vehicles. It is a crazy, crazy thing that we have set up. And so again, that's what this is actually looking like. A couple of years ago, I met with 10 of the largest transportation and city NGOs in the world, and we spent 7 months creating these shared mobility principles for livable cities. And the idea was, what are the 10 most important things that all of us would agree on? And I should have actually, you guys should go look at it sometime, sharedmobilityprinciples.org. And number one, think of you as architect students, is plan transportation and buildings together. Don't do them in 2 separate silos. And when I think about just transportation, move people, not cars. And I think of all the transportation policy and what's being voted on in Congress right now and in budgets around the world, it's all about how do we move cars? How do we sell cars? How are cars the transportation? And the focus is just wrong. We need to be thinking about moving people. And number 3, shared mobility principle number 3 is encourage efficient use of space and assets. This is an old photo from Market Street in San Francisco. And when it was taken 5 years ago, it was really impressive. So Market Street, 6 lanes, that used to be all car traffic. And they changed it so that the middle lanes here were public transit and you move 60 people per lane block. They put the bike lanes, you can move 40 people per lane block. And the car lanes, which used to be all 6 lanes, you're only moving 12 people per lane block. And then about 3 years ago, they just took out the car lanes entirely. And so now all of Market Street is public transit and bicycles. So making efficient use of space and assets and focusing how do we move people and not cars. Here's another analysis of Berlin that I thought was a really nice piece and of the amount of space it would take. And so let's look at the left side here. So you can see how much this is public rights of way and how much is given to rail, how much is given to bike, which is pretty amazing. I mean, this is Berlin, and how much is given to cars. And then when we think about autonomous vehicles, we, and I in particular, always want to point out that we won't need parking if they're shared autonomous vehicles. And you can see how much space this is here in Berlin inside that dotted square. Where's my cursor? Here. And that's in Berlin. In US cities, the amount attributed to parking is much, much larger relative to the car space. So there is a lot to be saved here. And this is just nice. If you look at this wheel here, this is how people, the circle is how people actually move, where their trips actually are. And that's the bar on the right, versus how we've allocated space, which is the bar on the left. And so you can see that people are moving, 44% of people are moving by car, but we're giving it 79% of the space. And likewise, you know, transit, 38% people moving by transit, we're giving it 13% of the space, and by bike, 18 and 8. London, famously in the last few years, has done this analysis, and on its major roadways, it has reallocated the road space to be what it looks like today. And it causes, it's an interesting thing, but we also know that people don't bike because there's no safe place to bike. And so you have to have this gap of giving people space so they decide they want to move that way. And so then we also think about electric autonomous vehicles. And so if you look at it from an energy consumption perspective, and here is all of transportation emissions, which are 23% globally, 27% of emissions in the US. And light duty vehicles, meaning passenger vehicles, I think are 15% of emissions in the US. So you can see of all the ways I can travel, this doesn't include much goods movement, it does include some, but road transport, as in our blasted cars, are just eating up the lion's share of these emissions. And so again, why are we traveling by car? Like, why is that where our focus is? And are EVs going to do that? And here is that transportation, energy, and population density. I just want to point out, look at Atlanta at the top, and Houston and Denver and San Francisco, which we think is great, and even New York, which we're so proud of, relative to other cities, and how they are not squandering the amount of CO2 emissions in transportation that we are. So our way of life in the US, and even I want to say in Europe, which is still way down, is just a crazy choice because it's car dependent. This is circular economy work. This is emissions per passenger kilometer traveled. And what I want to point out here, so this is just the life cycle, building the vehicle, building infrastructure for the vehicle, maintenance costs, fuel costs. And what I want to point out here is, yeah, transit is way lower than any kind of car you want to have. Cars that are battery electric, cars that are internal combustion, cars that are hybrids, doesn't matter what kind of car. So you're driving, and even ride sharing, they all are just gigantic relative to going by transit or micromobility. So I had this sentence, a friend of mine has written this nice piece. His name is Saul Griffith, and he does amazing, his work is, I think, called Rewiring America. He had this great quote that I loved, because everyone's pricing for electric cars. Electric cars reduce the CO2 emissions for cars by 1/3, meaning you make it electric and there's still 2/3 of the embedded emissions associated with building that car and building the infrastructure. And so electric takes away 1/3, but you've still got 2/3. And if we're moving to zero emissions, it's still a bad place to double down. So here are these shared mobility principles that I just wanted to bring up. And you can see number one, plan cities and mobility together. And why I'm putting it here is, if you look at number 10, when we worked through this with these 10 NGOs, I was voting for not number 10 because it would just fall out, but they wanted it stated explicitly. And the full number 10 is, in dense urban areas, automated vehicles must be shared. And so that is something that I'm going to talk about immediately now. This is for cities. When I did Zipcar, what I learned when people think about taking a car or not, when you own that car, you're thinking, what's my cost for this trip? And you're only thinking of the marginal cost. So you guys all out there in the audience, you're like, you experience that. So what's it going to cost me by car? It's the gas, maybe pay for parking. If I have to pay a lot for parking, I might not go do that trip. But it's gas and parking is what you focus on. And what I've really been, and so when you do Zipcar or when you do Uber and Lyft, you're paying the full costs of using that car. So with Zipcar, I would joke, if I have my own car and I want some ice cream, I say, I'm getting in the car and going to get ice cream, like whatever, it's just insignificant. But if I don't own a car and I have to use Zipcar, I say, oh, I want some ice cream. Well, that's going to be $12 an hour. You know what? I'm going to eat the stale cookies and I'm going to get ice cream on my way home from work tomorrow. So when you have to pay the full cost of ownership, you suddenly are forced to make these economic decisions based on full costs and not just the marginal cost, which is what people who own a vehicle do. And so it suddenly makes you decide which is the right mode to take. And so that is why in dense metropolitan areas, all autonomous vehicles need to be shared so that people, when they move that car, they're thinking of the full cost, because what we never calculated when you think of what is my cost for this trip, you never thought about, oh, my body is a cost and my time is a cost. With autonomous vehicles, that is no longer a thing. Like my time isn't in the equation anymore. The marginal cost to move an electric autonomous vehicle, Lou Fulton at UC Davis did this research, is a penny a kilometer or 1.5 cents a mile. So if you think of the speed that you move in cities, maybe 15 miles an hour, the speed you're going to move on highways, on average 50 miles an hour. So for 75 cents on a highway, when would you not send a car out to do something for you? When would you not want that car to be your lackey? All the time you'd want that car to be your lackey. And to make my case really strong, here's my cell phone. You guys are probably too young to remember perhaps, but when there were cell phones and when they introduced cameras to the, to the smartphone, you're thinking to yourself, it's great, you've got a camera in there. And I know the camera costs 40 cents for the phone, for them to add it. But you're thinking, camera's great, but I take photographs on birthday parties, special events, and vacations. Like, I don't need a camera. Now that I have this in my phone, we use it 40 times a day. I take a picture of my shopping list, I take a picture of the map, I take a picture of my whatever and send it to my daughter. What do you think of this? Is this constant chronic, I use it to identify a plant. I use it like 1,000 ways. That is what's going to happen with autonomous vehicles that are personally owned, because we know my own car with my own body in it is idle 95% of the time. And I'm making my 5% trips based on marginal cost. If my body isn't involved, I now have this 2-ton piece of vehicle, which might be electric, but remember, still 2/3 of still enormous CO2 emissions embedded in that I'm going to send around and do whatever in hell I want. And I won't care if it's peak time and full of traffic, because if my body is not in it, whatever, I really don't care. So this is my horror part. And I think right now, I'm going to I'll just say one more word and then I'm going to show a little video. So autonomous vehicles transform the economics of of driving a car when you own it. When you own the car, because my body is no longer in it, you have these transformed economics, which mean more vehicle miles traveled per person. So whenever I'm thinking about autonomous vehicle policy, it really matters whether those vehicles, not people, whether the vehicles are driving in some exurban place where there might be plenty of road capacity, or urban places where there is very little road capacity. And so whenever I think about policy for autonomous vehicles, it really matters where in fact you're talking about it. So unless, I just want to say, congestion pricing, if you say we're going to have congestion pricing wherever there is congestion, that would smooth the urban and exurban diversity. Because if there's capacity, I'm not going to charge you the congestion piece of whatever I charge you. But if there isn't, you will be. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. I'm going to go to Evan, and he's going to show you this locally. Oh, sound. Evan, are you getting sound?
Economics than our current cars, and so won't fit in well with today's rules of play. I see two distinct possibilities for our automated car future: heaven or hell. We get to choose. Forward-thinking leadership is going to make all the difference. We get hell by taking a wait-and-see approach. In this future, people buy AVs instead of today's cars. For trips, once you get to your destination, instead of paying for parking downtown, it'll be cheaper to have your empty AV circle the block or drive back home. The same is true for stores. It could be cheaper to have a drugstore car drive to customers than to pay for retail space downtown. Today, 75% of all cars on the road have one occupant, the driver. In the future, as we add more cars operating with their different economics, 50% of the cars will have no people in them, running low-value errands or avoiding parking. Meanwhile, all the taxi, bus, shuttle, and truck drivers will lose their jobs. We'll also lose about 60% of our tax revenue that finances road infrastructure, because AVs are electric, don't park, and don't get parking tickets. Our roads and bridges get a whole lot worse. We definitely don't want the hell scenario. We get heaven by taking a proactive approach. Over 1 million people in US cities are already car sharing. And in San Francisco, 50% of the people using ride-hailing apps now share their trips with another passenger who's a stranger. Instead of spending $9,000 a year on your own car, when we combine car sharing and ride-hailing and buy a seat in a shared autonomous vehicle, we can get door-to-door transport, at the speed of private car travel for the cost of a subway ticket. This transforms people's access to opportunity. Car sharing eliminates the need for parking. Ride sharing reduces congestion. We will only need 10% of the cars we have in cities today, even at peak times. No more on-street parking, no more parking garages. If most of the AVs in cities are shared cars in which people can share trips. We can widen sidewalks, plant trees, put in bike lanes and benches. We can get rid of parking lots and build affordable housing, or public parks, or whatever. Establishing the criteria and priorities for newly available public land will be critical to making sure communities get what they need. We could also reduce air pollution and CO2 emissions as we move from gas to electric power for our cars, but only if we demand this new incremental electric energy use be renewable. Happily, electric AVs will pay their fair share for road and bridge repair because we will have made and created new user fees that apply to them. We'll discourage empty zombie cars and make it more expensive to drive and to park. But wait, what about all those people who used to drive, repair cars, pump gas, design, and build cars for a living? They worked hard and their jobs disappeared almost overnight. We need to make sure that people can diversify their income with benefits that are portable and apply no matter how few hours you work. And we need to start piloting basic income. So if we want heaven and not hell, we have to start working together to get the right laws and regulations in place now, especially for the first cities that set the example. Just as your head is reeling from the impact and potential for self-driving cars, realize that this is just the tip of the big automation iceberg. Automation delivers enormous productivity gains without the associated labor. It's like making honey without the worker bees. How will we distribute this new kind of honey? Automation gives us reason to reconsider how, why, and where we tax, and to think anew about what kind of world we want to live in. So let's talk. Please contact me.
So back to me. So will autonomous vehicles cause us to double down on car dependency? And so again, here's just the same chart, a different way, the annual kilometers traveled per capita. And you see Houston right up there. LA, we're so impressed. LA's been doing such great work. It's still way up there. And then you come down to what London is looking like. So I wanted to just draw out in the US and many national policies around the world, we have a car first transportation policy. What we're saying is we want to move cars and people are going to get cars. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about this over the last few years, and it's incredibly inequitable because a huge number of people don't have driver's licenses. And right now, this whole group is invisible. So it's actually 30% of the US population is less than 16 and doesn't have a driver's license. So 30% of the humans that are alive on this planet have to be driven by someone else in a car first society. And sure, a lot of them, like my 1-month-old grandchild, are not going to be doing that driving. But you know, from the age of 8 or 9, you could be going places which you can't do now. There's the fraction of people who are elderly who shouldn't be driving. 18% of Americans are functionally disabled. There's a huge number of people who've had their licenses revoked for in some states, pathetic reasons. Like you didn't pay the $25 double parking ticket that you got, and then your license is revoked because you didn't have the money for it. Then there's people who don't have access to a car. So 8% of all households in the US have no car. It's actually closer to 9%. And if you're a Black household, 19% of Black households don't own cars. And so again, it just is kind of infuriating and maddening when you think about our car first policy when 20% of Black households do not have cars. Then I want to just point out the 40% of households with one car. So a whole bunch of you and a whole bunch of us are living in those households. And so one driver takes that car and then everyone else is stuck in their suburban house while that other person is out doing whatever they're doing with the car. And then there's just people who don't have the money. So you might have a car and you can't pay for its repair or you can't pay for gas. Cars cost around $10,000 a year. There's this nice blog that was written today by my colleague at Numo on talking about this electric vehicle amount of money that is in the infrastructure bill that we think is way too much. She had this nice sentence that says, entrance into the economy in America a car is required for participating in the American economy or something along that. And that is a crazy ask. In average across the US, people's cars cost about 15% of their household budget. For the lowest quintile, it's 32% of their budget goes to paying for their car. Via, which is a ride sharing company, they recently just put out this study where they looked at counties across the US. There are counties in the US where people were spending 80% of their income on their car. And why do people do that? Because they can't get to a job without the blasted car, which all these are positives for autonomous vehicles. So I feel if we can get to autonomous vehicle heaven, I love the idea of them. But if we're going to have autonomous vehicles and we're going to go to the hell side, we have just made the rich people are going to be the ones who get their cars first. And instead of driving the cars with their own bodies in it, they're going to be doing 10 times the trips with no bodies in it and doubling down on congestion and the misery for all the people who are not going in electric autonomous vehicles. So we really have to get this right because we have all the savings from deaths. We have improved access, which is fantastic. But we have to get it right because otherwise it just makes it worse. So I just want to move on to quickly a few slides on goods delivery. So if I think about today, you guys are studying some urban planning. Retail is all clustered on Main Street. And if you can afford it, you want to have your shop on Main Street because that's the best spot to be in. And if you want to pay less rent, you're down at some other, less valuable, desirable location. Or you might store your stuff in a suburban warehouse and you're having stuff delivered. And we're really seeing this today with the rise of delivery and what it's doing to our downtowns. When I think about this, what's happening here? With autonomous vehicles, we're going to have what I call a retail autonomous trips, RATs. And all of those stores are going to go into trucks. All the inventory is going to go in trucks. And it's just going to be flooding our streets where they're going to be driving for free because we let everyone drive for free on our streets. And it's going to be making our lives miserable, ruining our downtowns. And I think about this, I think of this as welcome to hell, like another version of autonomous vehicle hell. And let me just see if I don't have this here. What I have in text here is RATs in the countryside could be okay. It could be okay to have all of that retail stuff and all that inventory in trucks moving around in the country. RATs are okay in the country because there's a lot of open space, but RATs in the city and in urban spaces are impossible. Like we cannot have, and I feel like I see it in my downtown Cambridge now. There's 9 and 10 deliveries a day of these trucks coming down my street, not to my house, but to others. So the pandemic, this is brand new data. This is e-commerce as a share of total retail. And so you can see that in 2010, it was 3.5% or something. And today in the US, it was greater than 15%. This number, when I went and looked at it more wholly, counted in retail sales, as you use money, cars out of this equation, this percent of retail that's now online is much, much higher. It's just how they're calculating this statistic. And so now I'm actually going to stop sharing. These are all the questions that Evan talked about in the stop sharing. So you can see some Q&A of which that we're throwing autonomous vehicles into the middle of.
Great. Can you hear me, Robin?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. That was super, super enlightening and super, super packed with information, that lecture. A lot of
Lots
stats,
of context.
a lot of content, but it's really great. I've kind of written down kind of a few buckets of topics that you covered, and maybe I might kind of frame them in 3 or 4 buckets that we could begin to ask questions or have a discussion about. But I think for me, I mean, it's super good. I know all my students have seen the video that you showed, and for those who are digital, I would recommend checking that out if you weren't able to see it or listen to it carefully. But I think there's 3 or 4 major things that I think of buckets that you brought up that I think are super important to talk about, because coming here situated here from the design and planning schools at UVA, it's really and what this course is going to be about is what is our role as like designer, architect, planner in this conversation. And we talked about this a little bit before, which was this idea of providing an imagination, almost like a goal that visualizes the either the hell or the heaven outcome for many of the population and even OEMs and even public policymakers to see, so that we can reach that future. And that is tied into this first bucket, I think, that you said, which you started out with, which is this idea that we need to really plan, do development and transportation together. And yet, in the way that we, the way that private and public property lines are developed in this country and in these cities, it's often, transportation engineers doing the roads and the highways, and then you get land use planners and architects doing the buildings on top of that. And there's this almost like silo of disciplines that are contributing to this issue where, we're not thinking holistically about the design of our cities and how mobility is intrinsically tied to the design of the cities. And so that's, I think, one big thing I'd love to hear you, talk about and elaborate on, and maybe, see how we can.
I had to laugh a little bit. One of the things that I give, well, pre-pandemic, I used to give about 200 talks a year around the world, and not so many now, but I feel like my job in those days, or when I'm talking to policymakers, is to try to push them. I want to show them the absolute cutting edge of what's possible, and then they go back and say, Robin, you're crazy. Here's the practical reality of things, right? So today we have environmental review, which is trying to capture all the second order effects, and it's tedious, awful, annoying, and it's too late, right? You've kind of designed this, and now it doesn't encroach on the design of buildings. So if I think about transportation, another talk I give is about the huge underpricing we have for cars. We've spent the last 100 years making cars easy and convenient and really absorbing all the costs. The social cost of driving cars is 9 times the cost of what it actually costs to drive cars. So if I think about how I'd love to arrange that, I want to say, because we're human, we should get 1 square meter to move around in for free. That's our right. As a person, I get 1 square meter for free, and I can do my square meter for free in like a half square meter wide on a bicycle or some moped type of thing. But when I'm sitting in my 7, 8, and 9 square meter vehicle in a congested space, I should be paying for that. I should be paying for all those additional square meters. And so I'd say, as a baseline, when I think about, and I want to say, let's say vehicles of any kind, I'm always trying to do, one of the shared mobility principles is fair user fees across all modes. I'd like to set things up that are just, that some person can't be yelling at me that I'm preferentializing pedestrians or bicyclists. So as I say, baseline, you get your first square meter for free, done. If I have my giant, enormous bike that is like 5 square meters, I'm gonna start paying on top of that. So I'd like to see us do a footprint per square meter fee. And so trucks, Humvees would spend more than a Bolt per square meter. I'd like us to charge based on emissions, tailpipe emissions. And so again, if I was visiting someplace recently in the middle of the country, and I saw for the first time, there are these pickup trucks with a metal, you're going to see I'm not a car person. There's pickup trucks with a metal pipe up the back, and they do this huge, big black smoke out. Have you ever seen this? I don't even know what their name is. But in any case, emissions, we should be charging per emissions. So when you got your car, you would know what your square footage was and what your emissions was, and or any vehicle. And based on that, you would know what your per mile price was. So for every mile you traveled, you'd be paying this. Then I would layer on top of that congestion pricing. We also, as planners, a wonderful, famous transportation person here in the Boston area is Fred Salvucci. He was Secretary of Transportation for a while and stopped one of those inner city highway projects in his youth. He's in his late 80s and he is still going strong. He's one of my heroes and role models. I took a course of his and he was pointing out, and this is what I feel like I want to point out to everybody who's crying for more parking in urban areas. He would say cars have two modes. They have a moving mode and they have a parked storage mode. I want to say there's three modes: moving, stored, and pick up and drop off. So if I think about pricing, the per square footage and emissions price based on your actual vehicle, that's the moving piece. And then you layer congestion pricing on top of that. And then there is another price for storing your car and another price for the pickup and drop off. So it would help address, when we think about autonomous vehicles, if we could get that pricing right, which when I started this quest 5 years ago, I thought I would only be charging autonomous vehicles. And then the autonomous vehicle manufacturers wanted to kick me upside the head and say, oh my God, you're making us, they'd say, you're killing the baby in the cradle. And I think, you're not a baby and it's not a cradle. But I do think they have a point. And so my ideal, as I say, would to be, let's make it equal across everyone. And so if we got the right price for the vehicle footprint and the right price for congestion pricing and the right price for emissions and did this pickup and drop off, it would dramatically curb. It would be real time. Those would be included in some of your marginal costs. It would curb this zombie vehicle piece going around. So that is and then how you address the urban planning piece of this. Fred Salvucci also had this nice piece where he was saying that we should be, clearly we should have no parking minimums for sure, no parking minimums. But he wanted us to also charge per parking spot for every place. So if you built a parking spot, you'd be paying an annual fee for that. Because malls, for example, are built on, how many parking spaces do we need on Thanksgiving, the day after Thanksgiving, right? And so they build this huge number of parking spaces because once they build it, like, who cares? So they build for this peak one day of the year. And if they had to pay a fee, a tax every year per parking space, they would really think hard about how many parking spaces do I actually have to have. I'd also like to see parking and unbundled from any retail, office space, housing. Like I should have to buy parking in addition, or I have to pay parking rent in addition. And ideally, again, those go down to per day and not a yearly pass. So every single thing we do, we want to get as many of those fixed costs that are invisible to us and push them into real marginal costs for movement. And I guess that, I'd say, is how to summarize my thesis around all this. How do we make true costs visible in real time so that I make better choices? Which leads me to a piece I didn't say before, and I just want to touch on right now. I said I'd give another talk on, there's a book that I would recommend to people that was very influential to my thinking. Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And so he's a behavioral psychologist. And his work over like 30 years showed that we humans like to think fast, i.e. I want to do the easy, convenient thing and actually not do any math, not think about it for a second. I just want to do the simple thing. And thinking slow is, okay, I'm gonna have to do the math, which is better, which is the right thing, make some hard decision. We've made cars the easy and convenient thing. And that's what we choose. I want to say our human infrastructure, our human genetics goes to the easy, simple thing. So if you think about autonomous vehicles, that is the most easy and simple thing you could ever have. Like, I'm going to go out my front door, I whistle, it comes to me, and then it's going to drop me right in front of wherever it is I want to go. And then I'm going to go do what I'm going to do. and then I'm going to say, come get me. And it's going to, so I will do zero drive, zero walking. I was talking like 4 years ago or so, I was at a conference and I was talking to this architect working for McKinsey, and his job was thinking about how to do these 5,000 or 10,000 step cities. Because in places like Hong Kong already, people are not doing any walking at all because there's so much convenience involved. And we have elevators and we have escalators and we have like moving sidewalks and we have ferries. And I just want to get into your mind. And here's something, actually, Evan, you should assign as homework. when I finally to think about what would autonomous vehicles do to change your daily behavior, I want you to have one day where every single thing you do, think, if I owned an autonomous vehicle right this minute and I was paying $0.015 a mile, how would I travel? And so I realized when I did this experiment that instead of riding my bike to Harvard Square to meet someone for breakfast, this business breakfast, I would take the car. And then I would, instead of sending my teenager son to go take the subway to your friend's house, I'd say, oh, let me send the car back to you. And then when I was done with my breakfast, I'd say, oh, come pick me up at 9:30. And then I'd realize I'm still chatting with him at 9:30. So please double park outside this hotel or go around this block. So I encourage you guys to all, in your own personal daily life, take a day and imagine how would you do things differently if you had your basically free autonomous vehicle at your beck and call. And I think that gets you into this real mindset of we're humans. We respond to economics and convenience. What happens?
That's great. Yeah, I mean, there's many things, additional things you brought up in that response, but I think one of the biggest things that I heard was just this idea of space allocation, because inevitably that is a question of design, right? And that's where we we as architects and designers and planners and what we're studying here is a question of how do you allocate that space in the public right of way, in the street section, even like you're saying, the tying of the land use between parking and programming like retail or office uses, right? And these are all inherent planning and design questions that manifest themselves in the built environment in a certain way. And that's really the lever we have. And that kind of leads me to my next kind of bucket that I kind of distilled from your lecture, which is this idea of the cultural aspect of the car and the obsession of kind of, at least in the American context, the love of the through Hollywood and media adverts and all this, like there is this obsession with the freedom, the personal freedom that's offered by the private vehicle. And I'm thinking the same way as you in that public transit and public transportation is the much more sustainable way to get around. It's energy, and it's more equitable, but at the same time, there's this obsession and this kind of love, and also
so here's my
thing. Yeah. And how do you
here's my answer to that. If you've traveled, I grew up in the Middle East, and there were so many different ways to go places that I could walk. I could take a subway. I could take a taxi by myself. I could take a taxi with many other people. I could take a public bus. I could take my own car. In a world where we have not charged correctly for congestion and space, me driving in my Hummer in Manhattan next to the bus that has 60 people in it, it is saying that me and my 20 square yards, and you and your 1 square yard are equal. And that is profoundly not true. If we got the pricing right, or if we did lane reallocation, what I'm saying is, this panoply, and in the US, we have now, through regulations, taken away a lot of the finesse of transportation options that are existent in emerging economies. And so I think, let's go to Uber and Lyft. You can go in Uber and Lyft by yourself. And I want you to, and you'll pay for that whole experience by yourself. And that's a full cost. Let's pay the full cost. Or you could choose to be one of 4 passengers and you'll pay 1/4 of that. And so I'm not against someone deciding, I've had a really terrible day. I don't want to have one human breathing on me. I've got people who have COVID. I have COVID. I whatever, and I'm going to pay this crazy price and I'm going to do it. Go for it. But right now we don't have that at all. We have people alone in their cars, sucking up all the space out of those of us who are space efficient. There was one other point I wanted to make. When we talk about design, there's another talk I give, thanks to my husband who came with the sentence, infrastructure is destiny. And infrastructure is destiny, when in the 1950s, 1940s, we started to build tract housing. And then in 1956, we built the interstate highway system. That basic infrastructure of single family houses out nowhere and the interstate system with 100% certainty delivered us congestion and obesity in the US. Like that infrastructure became our destiny. We haven't talked about climate. I hope at some point you talk about climate. I can think of, I was talking to someone yesterday who I was giving money to. I think the #1 issue for me in the world is democracy. That's first priority order. Second is climate. Third is equity. Talking to the climate piece, our planet is our most important infrastructure and we're completely screwing it up. And if we screw it up, there is no second thing. So that's a piece of infrastructure that we're going to survive. Coming to architecture and housing and transportation, we need to be really careful how we use it. And when you're talking about parking and whether we build parking or not, and I feel like I can picture in some of your classes, you're gonna be talking about, do we make autonomous vehicle lanes? We need to be building hard infrastructure, both the transportation pieces and the built environment, in as wide open a way as we can, because if we say, I'm building this highway for cars, you get cars. And if we say, I'm putting this lane for autonomous vehicles, then we're going to have autonomous vehicles. If you say, I'm building this parking garage and it's got sloped ceilings and they're 7.5 feet tall, it's only for cars forever and all time. So when we build, a friend of mine, Brett Fleischman, wrote this great book on infrastructure that was influential to me. And he was saying this same piece, that instead of being really clever in our thinking, oh, I know, I'm going to make highways extra safe, so I'm going to have these wide shoulders and these wide lanes and this whatever, we've now made it only good for cars. So when we're thinking about building, I'm really anti autonomous vehicle only lanes. I'm anti autonomous vehicle only parking spots. I'm anti, let's build, when we're putting in parking, which we shouldn't build, we should profoundly make sure it has crazy 9 and 10 foot ceilings and flat, whatever it's called, I've forgotten, flat plates, so that it can be turned into something else during its lifetime. So as we think, just remember this sentence of infrastructure is destiny. And when we get really smart and clever and make it just work for that one thing, that's all it works for. And as we're going through this climate crisis and what it turns our cities and our houses and our buildings and our environment into, and we think about urbanization and malls, I mean, everything is so much better if we build it really flexibly and at this other way.
That's
Sorry,
great.
I'm doing core brain dumps now for you guys.
No, it's good. It's sparking a lot of thoughts. I have a couple more points, but I actually would love to open it up to the group, the class here, and then also any questions from the wider audience. Feel free to raise your hand and I'll get to you. But yeah, I'd like to open this up to our class here and start a discussion as well. And if anybody have some questions, please.
And I'm reading the chat. I'm used to chat and I can read the chat.
Perfect.
How do I say pandemic impacting, yes, autonomous and shared car policies? It's really, I was talking to Evan before the class. The pandemic has done these positive and negative things, and our policy decisions coming out of it are complex. So on the one hand, for the pandemic, a really fascinating and amazing thing happened, which is this term essential workers and essential places. And that never was a thing before. And so suddenly we've understood, oh, there's essential services that I need: food, health, let's throw schools in there. And they're essential workers who need to get to those places. And most of those essential workers cannot afford and cannot get there by themselves in one person in one car. So it was a very, and as I say, I don't see that we as policymakers or decision makers are fully making use of that kind of understanding, that public transit is critical and non-car transport is critical. So what happened in the early part of the pandemic, all of the TNCs, so Uber and Lyft completely shut down, as did the shuttles. Public transit had this huge crash. That's not a good word to use. And there was a rise of walking, localness. The bike sales around the globe doubled, if not tripled, in that time period. And so people, Zipcar, everything just like did this huge crash. Then with the first opening up, what they found was, and BlaBlaCar, which is ride sharing, BlaBlaCar and Zipcar had this huge, gigantic boon, because suddenly people are saying, do I have to buy a car? Lots of people can't afford and aren't going to buy a car. So I'm not going to fly, and I don't want to take a train, so I'm going to do a Zipcar instead. Or I'm going to do ride sharing with 3 people in the car instead of getting on the train with 400 people. And so they saw, so again, whenever we think about transportation, it's what are my options? And people are making their decisions based on options. An interesting piece about the public transit piece, and it just makes me crazy, and the CDC out of the gate said, don't ride in public transit, which was wrong. There have been no proven cases to COVID in public transportation. Like around the world, there haven't been. As I say that, Delta seems to be so incredibly contagious that I don't want to throw Delta virus in there. But you saw in Hong Kong, who did a big study, in Austria, they did a big study, in Paris, they did a big study, in London, they did a big study. There was no COVID transmission allocated to transit. And transit, particularly subways and buses with their windows open, have this huge air circulation. Despite that, people are buying cars because the rich people are buying cars. Let's be clear, rich people are buying cars. So we have this opportunity to like make better sense of that. So I think people still can ride share, and they should. So it depends on us.
That's great. I got some
which one should I
questions.
do?
Yeah, actually, I'll have the students ask you themselves, so you can kind of put the name to the question. Cassie, do you wanna? These are some really great questions that are in the chat, but Cassie, do you wanna?
Okay, well, I'm going to answer this question while you figure out how to make people unmuted. So Cassie, that is a good question. And since I've done a lot with the sharing economy and platforms, I want to remind you that when Airbnb first happened, people were thinking, that is a crazy ass idea that I'm going to go sleeping in someone's bed in their house. Like, no way. Or when Uber and Lyft started, you would never, ever do that. And I was in DC pre-pandemic, and I was looking across the street, and this beautiful 25-year-old Black woman got into the back of an Uber or Lyft. And I just thought, wow, we have come so far that this woman feels completely fine getting into a car where someone is a driver and can take her to who knows where. And so I feel that this whole idea of trust and fear is very overblown. And so the first users, indeed, there's this caution. And so those first users, when I think about Uber and Lyft, they're probably young white men. But then they go tell their friends, like, I've taken this 20 times. It hasn't been a problem. I've slept in Airbnb all these times. It hasn't been a problem. And because we all follow this economics and convenience piece, we're going to do it. We're going to turn on a dime. So it's going to be a short period of time. So I think, okay, we have, some city is going to have its 6 autonomous vehicles, or Waymo has however many cars it's got driving around. There've been no car accidents. No one's died. It's been fine. And those users are going to tell the other users, and then it's just going to expand rapidly. It's cheaper, faster, more convenient. So when the whole trust issue is brought up, I want you to think back on your own experiences, your own life experiences with using things like Airbnb and Uber and Lyft.
Great.
Lauren, you want to try reading it?
Yes, I'm going to pass it to Lauren and see if her voice works first.
Hello? It's
Yes, but no video.
I'm Lauren, and I wanted to ask how densified would cities become with the introduction of shared AVs in the heaven scenario, and how would these cities have to grow in terms of resources?
I'm going to answer your question the way I think about it, and so it might be like an 80% answer. So you might walk away and say, one of the things that's been really interesting about traditional car sharing today is that it only works in dense metropolitan areas. And what I would even say is it works where there's a density of people who don't need a car to get to work. So it works in university towns because the faculty, staff, and students don't need cars to get to their daily routine things. So car sharing works where you have a density of people who don't need a car to get to work. What's amazing about autonomous vehicles is it's now taken the geography of that density and expanded it, because with car sharing today, I have to walk the 5 minutes to a car that's parked there. Or if we think about Uber and Lyft, if it's going to take them more than 5 minutes to get to me, I'm not interested. But with autonomous vehicles, there's no one, you don't have that cost of the driver. So I think it makes vehicle sharing possible to a much broader, less dense geography. And if I think about really suburban areas or rural areas, if we have personal autonomous vehicle ownership in those areas, I do believe people will be renting them out to their neighbors for their second and third cars. So I'll own one autonomous vehicle. I'll be one household family. And I've also been playing my autonomous vehicle game no matter where I am. And so I was on vacation in a sort of a rural part of Maine. And I realized that rural people, I think, are going to continue to want to own their own cars because they'll feel very trapped. But I don't need to own 2 because I know my neighbor down the street, I can get his, and I will get his. So I have my one for my crises with my family with something. But now if I want to rent a pickup truck or I want to do something, I'm going to have my neighbor's car because they're not using it 95% of the time or some percent. So I think there is this potential to have so that's the use of cars that AVs will changes for whom car sharing or ride sharing is now a viable opportunity. If I think about, will it change where people live and work? We're seeing the pandemic has kind of played that out now, right? I don't have to go to work, so I can live anywhere. And that's the fraction of people who don't have to go to work and can do that type of work. If I think about people who are traveling to and if you have to get to your work, whether or not you're going there by autonomous vehicle, it's how many hours away do you want to be from your loved one? Could be your spouse, could be your friend, and it could be your children. The existence of autonomous vehicles doesn't mean I really want to live 2 hours away, because I have 2 hours plus 8 hours plus 2 hours, and I don't feel like being away that long. So I'm not completely convinced that autonomous vehicles are going to mean that everyone is going to go live in kingdom come, because it's how much time do I get to spend with the people that I love. So there will be some, but I don't think it's everyone. And as I say, I think I probably gave you about an 80% answer.
That's great. I'm going to have Tim read out his question now. also a really great question.
Sure. So my question is just, what are your thoughts on the non-AVs and where they all go? Do they become abandoned and left behind, or do they get re-outfitted? And since there's like space in that, the graph you'd shown with Berlin, there's more cars and there's space to park them. So what happens to all those that get left out?
I was on a stage with a person who was heading, I think it was Gina McCarthy, who's now something fancier. Someone asked that question of her, and it was the most hilarious answer. She's a really funny woman. She said, "Oh, they're going to turn into housing." Like, you can just picture. So you have this waterproof building. You're going to take out the engine because you're going to have storage there. They're going to be parked like RVs around a shared bathroom and shared kitchen. And while that is only partly humorous, because you can really see that happening, the other alternative is we're going to ship them to places that don't have our rules, just like we used to ship our dirty, stinky buses to when I lived in Egypt. The buses were just disgusting and had this huge stuff, and they were American buses or American school buses. So that's what's going to happen to them unless we make better laws, better things. And as we know, these cars aren't made to be taken apart. And so they're going to have unhappy endings. And one of the interesting things about this transition to autonomous vehicles, to electric vehicles, is right now, the average age of a new car owner is 53. I just looked up these numbers. 90% of new cars are bought by people who own their own homes. So most people are buying used cars. So when you think of this transition, it's incredibly slow unless we move to shared cars. Because my buying my own autonomous AV is, I'm going to be the rich 55-year-old who's going to be buying it first, and everyone else is going to be buying, hopefully, more energy efficient car that person had, their old electric car, their old hybrid, their old whatever, Rivian crazy truck. And so this is why, I mean, I think I look to you guys and to all of us. We have to make this transition on climate really, really fast. We have to reduce emissions 50% in 8.5 years. We have to do things in non-transitional ways, non-evolutionary, non-incremental ways. That's the word. We have to figure out how to pick up the pace of some of these transitions. And economics always plays a good part in economics and convenience. So I feel like people who live in cities might be willing to ditch their car if I was giving them, sell your car and I'm going to give you N 100 hours in autonomous vehicles. Or just like now, I'd like you to ditch your crummy car and get an e-bike and not something else. But so what are clever policy ways that we can get people out of their current thing into something else? But it's a real challenge. Next up.
I have a follow-up question to that, actually,
Yeah.
Robin, which is building a bit on Tim's question, which was a great question. But I'm wondering that, in like 50 years or whatever, when everything is autonomous, there's no problem then, because the vehicles can talk to each other. They're all synced up. There's maybe this transition to mobility as a service is prevalent. We've reduced car ownership. There's this transition to more shared modes of transportation. But in the interim, right, with the introduction of autonomous vehicles and non-autonomous vehicles, or cars that we have today, how do you see that transition happen? I remember seeing a poll once that was saying that, like, would you ever, it was polling, the average citizen, would you ever consider owning a autonomous vehicle? And there's like, hard
Yes.
group of 20%.
But you're saying
like,
that, but if I had said to you, would you ever get in a car driven by someone else to go to the airport? People would say no. Would you ever go sleep the night in someone's house in Portland? I did this in Pittsburgh. And I just thought, I cannot believe I'm doing this and other people are doing this. So those.
Yeah, it's just a moment in time and the culture changes.
And the piece about the two types of vehicles on the road, with 100% certainty, that is going to happen, and that is happening. And so it was interesting. A long time ago, I was at a talk with a person who was heading Google's cars at that time. And a person from the audience worked for the government, and she said, "What can the government do? What can we do to make things easier for you?" And she was talking about on the roads, and he said, "Nothing. We have to build our cars with today's infrastructure. We can't wait around for you to paint all the stripes in some way and the certain smart traffic lights. We can't do it that way. We can't wait for all the other cars wiped off the street so we can drive." No, they are 100% planning for this long, slow coexistence and existing infrastructure. So I feel like that's not a question. And honestly, I really believe that you have the front runners. So I get my AV, which I will never in my life get. But if I had my AV here, it's going to happen with electric cars. All the people who won't buy electric cars, and then their next door neighbor gets an electric car and they said, "Wow, the pickup is amazing. And I never have to go to the store, and charging, that's not a thing. Like I do it every night in my own house, whatever." And then it's going to be turning around because you listen to what your neighbor said, the person on your block, you're watching. And so you have the front people, but very, very fast after those front people, it's going to switch over. And horridly, I want to say horridly, if we don't get our pricing in, and they're expensive. So it really is either going to be used in a shared fashion because of the expense. So they will be. And one of the things I encourage you to look at is look at Tesla's ads for their autonomous vehicle. And you will see that they're all living the suburban rich male lifestyle. It's white guy driving from his crazy office park to his crazy suburban home out in the middle of nowhere. And that's not, well, that's not reality. And we can't have that happening.
So I'm going to turn it to Ramya because this actually might be a good follow-up question to, or yeah, point to this discussion. So Ramya, go ahead and.
Hi, my question is actually specific to last mile connectivity. So I was wondering, in a situation where public transit options like trains or buses are priced as low as taking a rideshare AV, the competition between the two would be inevitable, where the AV then has a chance of becoming the main option. So I just wanted to, hear your thoughts on what, some of the ways to address this could be.
So this goes to congestion pricing again. I was in New York City. Maybe Evan, can you turn off? In New York City, they were putting a $2.50 charge on Uber and Lyft trips. And I was saying, and I was really anti. And I was saying, what you're saying is, I should just own my own car, because if I don't own a car and I take a taxi, which I'm paying the full dang price for, so I don't do it lightly, you're making it more expensive. You're just making it more and more reasonable for me to own my own car. So if we think about this, it's the same kind of principle. If I don't have congestion pricing in the mix, well then, yeah, I'm in New York City and it's cheaper for me to take my own car. So why don't I take my own car? You don't care if I take my own car. You never penalized me for doing that. So why should I take the subway if I think my own car is faster and better? Because I get free parking at work, and for some crazy reason, I'd rather be in my car for an hour and a half than the subway for 40 minutes. But if we don't penalize congestion or square footage, well then we're rational people. Like, of course I will take it. And if everyone takes Uber and Lyft to work, or Uber and Lyft AVs to work instead of subways, because that's cheaper and faster, well then that's on us. Like, why do we make that cheaper and faster? So economics matters, but I also just think about these last mile pieces. I am extremely skeptical, and I only say it very quietly to the many, many AV entrepreneurs who are so proud of their pilots. And all the cities are saying, oh, we've got this AV shuttle. I think those shuttle buses that are doing their useless loops going 12 miles an hour from nowhere to nowhere, what are you learning? Like, they're not connecting me by last mile, and that I can wait 10 minutes for the AV shuttle loop to come instead of walking those 10 minutes. Like it is when they're so low speed and they're on these long intervals, they're adding nothing. So if we think about autonomous vehicles as last mile, hopefully they're small. Hopefully they're more on demand. I feel like, is it the right solution? I was doing some work in Pittsburgh where the city of Pittsburgh was trying to get this disenfranchised neighborhood of poor people in a hollow that was far away from public transit. They were trying to say, oh, we'll give you guys an autonomous vehicle shuttle last mile to the subway. And that community was having none of it. They fought for a year and a half and they said, don't give us that thing, would much rather have, actual bus service, would much rather have you fix the dang sidewalks, would much rather have crosswalks. The idea of you giving us this autonomous vehicle shuttle that is going to be this crazy slow thing coming on these intervals, we are not interested. So again, each one of these things, you have to think, what is my alternative? And how's my alternative in terms of convenience and in terms of price? And so and as I say, I'd like us to have safe bicycle infrastructure and safe micromobility to go those last miles than an AV. Lighter, cheaper, faster. Like, why are we taking these big, crazy things?
Is that how you feel about kind of Waymo's operation in Arizona too? Because, they're trying to create a model of complementing transit rather than competing with.
The Waymo model is at least moving at actual car speeds, right? So they're moving at car speeds. And I feel like there's all this talk about how they all say, as did Uber and Lyft, we want to be complementary to transit. I guess there's two things I want to say about that. They're truly complementary when I've made going the full distance, because why would I take the AV for 1 mile when I can take it for 5 miles door to door and it's going to cost me a nickel more? Like, answer me that. It's just like question number one. Why would I not take it the whole way? And then the second piece is, if these vehicles enable me to not own my own car, now it's a whole new calculus. And so I want to put it in two places, two lines of logic. If something can make me not own my own car, well, now it's completely transformed how I do every single trip, because every single trip I have to think motorized, expensive, like it's totally different calculus. But if my choice is, I'm going to walk the subway and then take the subway, or I'm going to take an AV to the subway and then take the subway, I just think, okay, why would I not take the AV the whole way? Because you're not charging congestion pricing. So for literally 50 cents more, and we're going to go the whole way. Why not? And I feel like it's not on Uber, Lyft, or Waymo for people to not make that choice. People are making rational economics and convenience choices. And until we as government or as policymakers don't make that more easy and convenient, well, then I'm just doing the rational thing.
Yeah, that's great. Lily, you want to ask your question?
Yes. So I was really interested when you're talking about rats, and then also thinking about like the heaven scenario of AVs, how we would have to price AVs to make it expensive, so it wouldn't congest the roads. So thinking about these two things in conjunction together.
If you don't own your own AV, it's automatically already priced more expensive, because okay, keep going.
Sorry.
I interrupted your question. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So I guess so. What I'm really interested in is like, how does customer deliveries? How do they? Like, how are they priced to the customer? Because right now, I guess we're so used to getting really fast deliveries and having to pay almost nothing. So how does this play with like in an AV space, or is it like more of a logistics?
I have my crazy policy dream, utopian policy answer, and then there's the reality. One day so I'm going to blame my daughter because she's not listening to me. She lives in Brooklyn. I was with her 3 years ago, and she was off having a baby, and I was in her house. And I am not kidding you. There were 7 deliveries to her door that day. And then I'll add the post office 8. This is downtown Brooklyn. So she'll say, oh, blah, 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 blah. I was pregnant, blah, I couldn't get these things, whatever her excuse is for the 7 deliveries. I'm not going to argue that point. But I'm saying, and I was thinking, wow, we really need to have a consolidated delivery service. And then I thought, oh, that's the post office. It's already been invented. And so then there's this piece that I was listening to someone else give this talk, and they were pointing out that, and this is why Amazon was so incredibly genius. Like, if I can get something delivered in a week to my door, great. And if you can do it in 2 days, great. And if you can do it in 2 hours, excellent. And if you can do it in a minute and a half, I'm down. Like, my appetite for convenience without cost has no, like, there's no capping it. There's nothing to constrain me if I don't have to pay for it. So in my dream policy, and I was trying to get the city of Pittsburgh to do this, I would like to see, and again, this is cities where their space matters. I'd like to see a $2.50 per delivery charge applied. I'm making up a number with 3 exceptions. So every delivery you get, $2.50 tax across the board. 3 except 1, delivered by the US Postal Service. They nicely consolidate things, deliver once a day. Check. Number 2, from a locally owned that employs people, I won't charge you $2.50. And we would have to do a lot of complicated fine details so that Amazon's little shop that they've got, whatever, doesn't count. Number 3, you're doing it in a zero emission micromobility, as in an electric cargo bike. You do those 3 things, I'm not going to charge you. And I would put that for autonomous vehicles, a micromobility autonomous vehicle. But when delivery, which is today, because people are Amazon subscribers, whatever it is, I am not a consumer. I put that on everyone else in my family. But you get free delivery, and you don't care if it's 2 days or 1 day, or like, sure, these shoes I could have in a week or I could have in 2 days. 2 days is better than 1 week, of course. Like, we have to make a cost for these things. I think we could do that kind of pilot in the right city. And there was this nice article that came out a couple of weeks ago that showed that cargo bike delivery does more deliveries per hour than bigger vehicle delivery in, I think it was some major city.
We have a question from John. He's not in the class, but attending digitally. John, feel free to ask your question, or Robin can also read it straight from the chat, whatever you prefer.
What's your pleasure, John?
Yeah, I'll just ask it over the chat. My camera's not really working. So I know that a lot of people own cars that are much larger than they need, just for the few times that they're able to use the size, such as, you know, you're always seeing pickup trucks all over the road, but almost never is anything actually in the bed. Do you see AVs having a large effect on the types of cars we see on the roads? Do you see that having an effect where a lot of them shrink down to small sizes just for convenience?
I think it goes 100% to whether you own it or not. Because I'll remind you, that was how car sharing was the huge win. And because you're completely right. When I own my own car, I buy it for that biggest use case, right? That biggest use case that happens once a year for a minute and a half. Even though 70% of the time I'm going on a trip by myself. I can have a van, I can have the fancy impress my date car, I can have I'm just getting someplace car. And so it really was and is, you can choose the right car for each trip. With autonomous vehicles, number one, they're expensive. So let's just take that expense piece out. Assuming you can afford it, because I think you'll be using it for so many different kinds of trips, and because I think you'll be able to rent it out to other people, I think we'll see the exact opposite, that people will do the same thing with AVs. Because now I will rent it out during the day for UPS package delivery. I'll rent it out to someone who wants to go do some long trip and back. so I don't see that. I think I want to put all of that burden of right sizing based on ownership. And whether you own it or not. But I do think you have that potential, you know, I'm holding out this hope that it could take away second cars. If it takes away second cars, then I think people would buy first cars and then they would rent that second car. Let me just, I see we have just a few minutes left, but I just want to, Bill McKibben, who is a friend of mine and I love his work. He's a climate person. He writes for the New Yorker. He writes for Rolling Stone. He's written many books. Recently, he wrote this article on, he lives in Vermont, on him using his electric car to get from his house to his daughter's house in DC and trying to do the charging. And so he was writing this article all about how, dang, there has to be way more charging stations everywhere. And it's like this crazy thing. He says, you know, I've owned this car for a year and a half and never had this problem. And I sat down and wrote him this email rant. And then I had my son read it and he said, don't send that. Because I know Bill better. And I wanted to say, Bill, you are going right down the path that everyone does when they're buying a car. You want to buy, you're saying, this whole system doesn't work because of the one trip I'm taking once every year and a half. Go rent another car that doesn't require charging. Go use an internal combustion engine for driving to your daughter in Washington, DC once every year and a half. It doesn't mean people should not be buying electric cars today because the charging stations don't exist for that one trip they do once every year and a half. So anyway, I was kind of maddened by that. And for autonomous vehicles, I don't see how it changes, and maybe you guys see it and I don't, and you should tell me. I don't see how the autonomous part changes that equation and the ability to use it for any blasted thing for anyone else, and your body's not involved, just makes me feel like it could get worse.
So I want to end on one question, Robin, which is kind of a way to transition to next week's lecture. And it's kind of underneath all of the things that we've been discussing this whole past hour and a half. So next week, we're going to have Salita Reynolds.
Yeah, I know Salita. Oh my gosh. Salita is marvelous. And she and I have one issue. Yeah.
Yeah, so you know, she's going to come and talk to us about the role of the public sector in this and the role of regulation and implementation, and a lot of the opportunities and constraints that brings. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, particularly because you've been talking a lot about the need for congestion pricing, curbside pricing, you know, pricing by the square footage that that you're taking up on public realm. Like, how much of this is in the hands of the public sector, and what is the role of the private sector in this? You know, a lot of the economics comes down to the private sector, right? In terms of incentivizing the right modal shifts, right? What is this balance and relationship, and what, you know, who's the onus on who, what party to move this?
So one of the things I want to say that you've done a great job having Salita and I back to back, because Salita is on the ground having to actually do these things in real life. Like, there's not going to be anyone who's more pragmatic than her. So I have built some companies, and let me just step away for a minute and say, the existing status quo we have today is the result of existing government policies and existing companies doing their work. So I have this question, and I'm going to rely on you, and maybe everyone knows where their hands up thing is, and you're going to have to go look at this. I'm going to do a poll. I'm about to set up a poll, and everyone online, I want you to do the poll by putting up your hand. Okay. I'm going to do this differently because I actually want to do it one time. So here's the question. Don't answer it. So here's the question. Do you think existing governments and existing companies can evolve fast enough to address climate change and inequality? Or will they move too slowly and the people will rise up and revolt? So do you think the next 5 years are one of evolution or one of revolution? Normally, I would ask evolution to raise their hands and then put them down. Now I'm going to ask you guys all to vote. If you think it's revolution, so those who think it's evolution, don't raise your hands. If you think it's revolution, please raise your hand. Okay, Evan, you see the whole suite. How many? What percentage?
So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 who have raised their hands out of the remaining 14.
Well, that is a pretty, you'll still see that it's more than 50%. And in large audiences, I usually see 80 to 90% vote for revolution. So this is why I was urging you guys to think hard about, and Salita is living this life. So I'm saying the words, we need to move more quickly. And Salita is living the, I can only move at this pace because here's the reality of what's happening. So I feel, as I look towards our survival as a species and as many, many species in the Anthropocene, I feel like this is the nut to crack. How do we speed the pace? Because doing things slowly isn't going to work. And Salita has done some things fast and she gets yelled at, and I might even be yelling at her. So what is the solution? And one of the things I want to leave you with, and think about Jeanette Sadik Khan and Salita. So Jeanette, and how I started, when is there an existing, simpler, cheaper solution than the fancy one? And so I feel like there's many policies around technology that we want to institute or we want to do because it's fancy technology and we look great and whatever, when like a lot of things that we can learn now, we can learn a whole bunch of things by observing everything I do with my cell phone and where I go and what I do and all my data points. Or we can do spot checks, or we can do, you know, the 2 lines on the roadway, or we can do. So one of the things we need to think about when we think of these major problems, what's the easier, cheaper, lighter, least invasive way to do things versus the other? And I'll leave you with one image that I'm constantly amused back. We didn't talk about sidewalk drones. Oh, this sidewalk drone will take the groceries for you from the store to you. And I think, and every time someone says this to me, I post the picture of that every European grandma has, the little rolling wire suitcase, you know, the little wire thing. And I think, why are we having these gigantic, crazy sidewalk drones to carry something that weighs 10 pounds, taking up space? So in any case, why are we doing these things? Why, and can we do it in an easier, lighter weight way? And so Salita is fantastic. Congratulations on having her come. You guys are lucky. Evan set up for you an amazing class.
Thank you, Robin. And on that note, since we've taken up over 7 minutes of your promised time,
Yeah.
I really want to say thank you so much. And also thank you to the audience and the students for giving such great questions. We had, I think, a really robust, wide-ranging conversation that touched many, many aspects and probably brought up more questions than it did answers. But I think that's the point, right? And
It's the point.
And again, thank you, Robin, for your time. And I'll definitely be in touch to show you the output of the studio of the seminar. And
I do want to know.
And there will be a lot of, you know, obviously your input is going to play a lot in the things that we design and think of going forward.
We'll be co-creating the future. Bye.
Yes, and it's on us, exactly. It's on
on
students,
us.
and it's on us as the designers and the planners. So
On us.
thank you again,
Okay.
Robin. Yeah,
Bye.
talk soon. Bye.